Foresight, written by Kevin Clinton. For you. The flashing traffic light, which was blinking from the southwest campus corner of the university, shone an ominous red glow into Tommy's eyes from out his bedroom window. He was only focused on this in his peripherals, however. Had he thought to consider it, he might have realized that the red was poising his head with one solid tone through to the inside of his own eyelids, casting red overtone to his dream sight. It was late, the sort of late that exists only between staying up too long into the night and waking up too early in the morning. His focus was only drawn from the hypnotic red tones by the drowning mental state of having been cramming for his final exams. Things were confusing, so. Some 24 half-scattered and half-collected receipts of his returned textbooks lay on his bedroom floor in a display that he had not been sufficiently organized in any way since, at the latest, 3 terms prior. Though how far back his consideration was unorganized was sort of the catch-22 that he didn't care to consider. Since moving out of the care from his parents and into the room he had rented from a house just off the university campus, which had enrolled him, he had been cheating the bookstore with every semester. He would buy all the assigned texts necessary for each of his courses, only to jot down the published information and return them to the bookstore for a full refund. He would then use the published information along with the owner's information on the receipt to buy the corresponding ebooks on the internet. This was early in the days of ebooks, when just about anything could be read on the internet for free and in full volume if it served a purpose. Had Tommy been able to tell himself from the future in which he would later discover a living, he surely would have kept the hard, tangible copies of the books and avoided his computer altogether all the time. He had not considered the repose of what he was doing, though, not since he was able to live on his own terms. He had lived a simple life when he was living with his parents anyways, always, and the public education he had attended prior to his current university had given him ample freedom to run with girls and party around and such, disallowing any of his present affordability wasting any time with such things as fun. Tommy saw college plainly as an opportunity to test himself on just how disciplined he could make his life out to be, however complicated, and so he avoided those girls and those parties, and he scrimped to save wherever he saw ability to do so. Also, rather than squander his time, Tommy studied hard, even if it took him into the night through to these late early hours. His parents had not been strict or cruel with him at all, but nor did they give him all the freedom for which he felt he needed to compensate. They were in fact so well to him that it just seemed the right thing to do to find his limits of freedom and his limits of discipline, combining the two by inspiring means. So he had assured them he could both support his own way through university and graduate too, but his penny pinching had gotten a little out of hand. He had been part of the workforce from an early age, even before high school, and had saved most of his earnings, but by his 3rd year it simply wasn't enough, and his diet and other health factors had suffered. His penny pinching had turned into squandering anything that he could financially, and so he starved, and so he quit his friendships, and so he gave up physical courses of study for internet courses, and so he purchased ebooks. Tommy's rented room from the house just off the corner of campus was in the basement, which had been segmented into 3 bedrooms constructions. There was also 1 shared bathroom and 1 shared kitchenette. When he moved into his room on the first day 3 years before, his next-door neighbor near to the kitchenette was just moving out from her own stay. Having come close to graduation with only 1 semester to go, she had given him some welcoming advice. It was to never mess around with anybody else in the house, and to keep up with school before worrying about any other finances. At that point, the girl took her remaining garbage bags of belongings to her parents' car, explaining to them why she had lost all contact for 5 years working on the thesis that was, in her words, going to secure her very little time away from work to visit for kind of a while. Such is the conundrum of spirit and the relationships we have with the awkward, I suppose. All of the happenings in life, though, which we try so hard to afford, are only really afforded through suffrage, and in sort of the same way that too many people lose sight of the pleasures and joys of life once we've succeeded to craft our lot to afford them. So did the girl become the lady who would work toward vacation for which she would never have the time, one might also suppose. As so did Tommy decide that his one method of study would be inspired and of joy in order to be afforded. Only in his 3 years he had forgotten the thought. He would not go on forgetting much longer. His neighbor nearest the bathroom had left the house shortly after the two had become intimate, and one thing we need to know to understand where our story begins is that Tommy was completely rejected by these two neighbors, and their reasons for leaving presided opposite sides of the same coin, so to speak. His neighbor nearest the kitchen had left in high spirits for the glories for which she may never afford the time, and his neighbor nearest the bathroom had left in the higher spirits of those glories, being that she had dropped out of school entirely to live with her family and experience her career through the support of the love which already existed for her. One was moving away to move on, and the other was moving back. Tommy didn't see any other sort of suitable options for himself. He already saw the contempt he'd have for making one living try and somehow support another. He'd only one life to live, and he certainly wasn't planning on wasting any more time with what had already been done trying to further the system he knew he didn't agree with, like the textbooks. Why should they be paid for even if by his parents? Why should educators be paid at all? It's not quite as important to the story that we know what all happened between Tommy and his neighbors. Suffice it to say, it was private and kept that way for good reasons. Not messing around with roommates maybe had been one rule of the other neighbors to follow. It was very difficult for anyone else ever to really have been able to tell they were together, and that's what made it very difficult for them to accept even their own desires to make something work from it. It's also what made it extremely hard for them to get over one another after having lived such insecurely the life near one another in quarters. Both neighbors would have quit school one way or another, but perhaps Tommy's thoughts wouldn't have dwelled in such disdain to his present moment had they not been driven so from the house as they were, for the reasons that they saw little joy in the stead he had in mind for himself. Did anyone understand? This story is meant to explain it to those who maybe enjoy knowing. Chapter 2. The red light still beamed into Tommy's window from the corner traffic light, an hour having passed as he tried to consider the best balance of work and play, and all in all having done nothing whatever for himself. Was it healthy? Not in the sense that it was already an unhealthy way to live. From drone frame of mind to another drone frame of mind of bored independence. Being that he was never satisfied with any of the leisure studies as they all turned into work studies. Rather, though, the sense that these frames of boredom had become his vacations. Mulling over things he could have been doing had become more to his leisure than actually doing those things, and this even was inclusive to his studies. One thing that did make him feel bad ripping off the bookstore. Unfortunately, it was late Sunday night or early Monday morning, and all his local bookstores were closed. He was sleeping through more weekends than not, moving to school, and since moving there. But on this particular Sunday, he couldn't help but remain awake. He roughly rubbed his eyes. His semester curriculum was nearly to its end, and so he knew if he didn't study occasional weekend durations, then his hard-earned senioritis for the following year would be lost. He'd done well these 3 years with what he considered to be real education. It wasn't as if he considered what had been taught through high school to have been too unimportant to give two hoots, and he studied it in his own way when away from class and available to do so. He just always knew that personally sought education was all any job that was worthwhile would have cared to consider. This particular night, he'd been reading the final chapters of each ebook corresponding to each assigned text for each course, and had even stayed awake for the whole day before doing the same. He had decided to just finish his learning the term all in one sitting, rubbing his eyes roughly again. He was in the midst of studying the principles of one designs course that one can only comparatively identify to the infamous graphic optical illusion style. It soaked up through Tommy's head as he studied it, since the night breeze outside his window had been so eerily calming this past hour. It was just the pressure which irked him so, made him restless. So restless that he even noticed the dancing flash of the computer screen, and the dancing flash of computer screens are only really noticed by anyone when the world around the computer has become even more still. Even occurrence of drastic degree could not have startled his captivation enough to make him realize just how dry his eyes had been, and long before he realized on his own accord, an electrical transformer which had blown from the street surged the screen into which he had been fascinating his boredom, staring to solid black. His head jerked him awake, and he tried his best to consider just how important what he'd been thinking about was. He couldn't even remember it at all. He looked about his room and kicked his feet from under his chair to rustle some book receipts before rubbing his eyes again. Chapter 3. The red flashing had halted, and there was a silence all around Tommy in the still air of the night. All was dark, and he stumbled blindly in his room, reaching toward the closet where he kept his flashlight. When it was finally in his clasp, he shone the light across his belongings upon the desk and collected his wallet and keys, deciding that he'd walk to the all-night diner down the road. He shone the light to the floor and kicked his way through the receipts and all other clutter until he was in the hallway. He shone the light into the rooms of his old neighbors, which had been vacant with the doors widely open for more than 2 years. An echo seemed to rush back from that light. It was the groaning that the vacancy of a house only sounds like when the humming of electric has been halted. Arriving at the top of the stairs and to the side door of the house, being sure not to awaken the tenants from upstairs as he opened it slightly enough to squeeze himself outside, he then latched it behind him as he made sure of his belongings. Wallet, keys, smokes. Igniting his first smoke of the night air, he walked to the road, taking a gander at the traffic light which had been blinking that red on all sides through these past. Come to think of it, he couldn't remember how long it had been since they were not powered. Nevertheless, they were now visually silent, swinging gently with the heavy breeze toward his destination as he gazed vaguely toward the fluorescent diner down the road. There was thankfully some people inside, although there wasn't any fluorescence, thus presenting opposition to the irony so commonly sought from such places, which serves when the lights are on but nobody's home in such matter of speaking. In this case, people were certainly home, but alas, no lights. He had normally visited this particular diner on an infrequent enough basis that he knew its regulars, and he figured he could meet with just about anyone that may have been there from before the power had gone that night and make some friends. They'd be figuring their bills and tips with the staff the old-fashioned way, so he knew it would take a while, far as circumstances he needed one anyway, the while being what he needed. He made it to the crosswalk before the startlingly loud thud from the visitors' lot of the campus caught his attention, to say the least. He turned his head sharply, and the building erected just the other side of the flickering streetlights, such a luminescence that Tommy wasn't sure whether it was the power being restored or if it was an alien landing in the building, became then fully white in every window. Those windows painted with white shone the parking lot and hummed with the sound of the generator, which disoriented Tommy just a little. He had to shield his eyes to gaze at all the wild wonder, and forgetting both the diner, which had been his safe destination, and the thud, which had frightened nearly the pants off him, he deduced that the building must be opening for school business, and decided to try to get on one of their computers to finish his design studies. He stumbled through the parking lot, glancing back only to see in the traffic light was on back up as well, but re-shielding his eyes as he pressed back toward the building, when not. A few feet from it, he could finally read the sign, which was being shown upon them with light, respectively by the energy from the generator which was standing next to it. The sign in front displayed building that was the campus library. It was already strange enough that Tommy had always thought it to be the Welcome Center, as it was located in the visitors' parking lot, having even gone inside for his orientation seminars almost 3 years prior, but he had never paid much attention to the goings-on with it since his first year at the school. After all, never having needed the Welcome Center after that, it didn't much matter to him what became of it. And he didn't exactly need to know where the library was, either, since he ripped his books off at the bookstore. Nevertheless, pressing on toward the door to which the sign led, he tried pulling it open to no avail. He pulled again, but nothing. After pausing a moment, he pushed, but still nothing. It wouldn't budge. Chapter 4. Tommy took another stroll back around the sign to see if hours of operation were listed, but none were. So he made his way around the building and to the opposite side from which he had come. He saw the ground-lit sign from behind one bush and was going to head toward the desired hours of operation read, but heard noise coming from the maintenance entrance and turned his attention to it. The maintenance entrance door was propped open by an open deadbolt, which was resting against the rusty door frame. Captivated by the premise of being inside the library after hours, or before hours, or whatever you would call these hours, he levitated toward the entrance until, tripping over the walkway section, which was raised just a bit from the ground, he crashed into the door and caused the frame to shudder before he could gain his composure enough to cautiously steady them both. He slowly took the door by its handle and pulled it from the prop to the narrow kind of open, which would allow him access to an inward sleuth, surprised at how light it actually was to open. Shielding his eyes even further, he squinted and stumbled through the fluorescent hallway, passing supply closets until he reached the second doorway, which actually was only the frame of a door, and not the door itself. At first, pulling at the absence of what he thought would be the door, the absence of the door bewilderingly would not open, and so he pushed at it and allowing fluctuating hollers to spill toward him as he fell over his feet, desperately shuffling upright body. The hollers from older men and women weren't directed at him, but rather they seemed directed downward at the floors of the rooms from which each came. He couldn't make out any particular words amongst all the noise because just how many people were in there yelling. He wondered what the hell was going on inside the campus library in the middle of the night and with no power. Suddenly coming to the strongest fear he even had of bums, homeless people. It had certainly explained the door having been propped open, the congenial gesture from one unto the other allowing entry, except that nobody was rushing to exit out the way they would have then entered now that the power had been restored to the building. Tommy pressed on into the main lobby and was greeted by one custodian with a name tag reading simply, Phil. "Have you come for life lessons?" asked Phil politely, "or are you just here to use the computers?" Tommy started. "Am I? This must be your first time then," Phil spoke kindly. "Are you attending university?" "I am." "Come for the night lessons or early morning ones?" Tommy asked, "Does the library put on some event here?" "You really haven't heard of them, have you now, son?" Phil jested, beginning to speak in near rhymes. "Well, I'll be your guide if you'll come inside then." He smiled widely and motioned toward the help desk. "Really, I only came in because you looked like the only building on campus with power," Tommy answered. "That's not strange at all. These parts get confused, though, and you look kind of drained. Too much to compute?" began Tommy. "Do you do that for fun or for show?" "Oh, well, books are for both fun and show. But if you mean about vocally, I'm just the host." Phil looked at his feet shyly. "The host of," Tommy began, drawing only the same strange grin from Phil. "You know, I've known some quirky custodians, but..." "Custodian? I'm just the guide. There are philosophy majors and business minds," Phil spoke, pointing into a few directions. "I'm in my third year here," Tommy explained, figuring that if he couldn't win with this man, he may as well join him at the end of it. "Then you'll surely like," Phil proposed. what we've turned the place into. The school doesn't buy it, but nor does it hinder. Phil explained to him, but the yelling was louder as if to yell over his speech. So the school doesn't sponsor this, but they let you do what exactly? Tommy was glancing past Phil, trying to get a glimpse at some student running out of the periodical set toward the front end of the lobby before she burst out the front exit, letting her tears into the night air. Disciplined, not appeased, is how we cut the cake, Phil started, but if you learn from these things, that doesn't have to be the case. He then explained some more desperately strained rhymes, that an older man from the periodical section merely had yelled the girl a point, and that she would live a better life away from the computer noise. "So what do you all do here then?" asked Tommy. "This place is for reeling," Phil responded. "Weren't you listening? Return the feelings for grand oppositions." "Are you part of it all for real, or are you just talking to me?" "For fun," Tommy had to ask. "You'll see all as you browse," Phil told him, walking then toward the periodical section to begin one soft conversation with the man who had chased the girl away. Chapter 5. Tommy made his way through the lobby toward the direction Phil had seemed to point him. He didn't know exactly what the operation being run there was, but he thought he could use a little curiosity. He had indeed been studying with the diligent work of others for so long that his actual curiosity was more of an inkling than anything out of the ordinary would be worth interest. So passing the periodicals, he looked in to actually see the teachers who had been yelling at the students. There were teachers who he knew. There were students who he didn't. Some of the students were on the computers ignoring the teachers altogether, and some of them were sitting on the floor with their knees in their hands rocking back and forth. The in-between stature that seemed to be held between caring too much and not caring at all was active listening. The teachers' voices could hardly be made out individually from one another, but the general yelling seemed to be about the desensitized nature that we get from the world around us. If not focusing on it as any more than background noise, then not truly listening, but actively listening would be what ultimately desensitizes all of the things that we need to hear. Tommy was reading, gathering already the scene around him, the idea that the main thought tended tonight to be the absence of the humming from power grids. He compared it to the noises of those things to which we only ever actively listen, and then he thought of the idea that one can only identify with things comparatively. He tried to focus his vision on one of the teachers and began to feel lightheaded. It had been over a day since he slept or eaten, and it was the yelling that seemed to desensitize to him. All the computers were running on backup energy from the generator and flickering in a way that would normally only be what one would be able to notice if gazing into them, only he noticed them all doing so. Their flickering seemed to augment the overall nuisance here in the atmosphere, and he realized something. It wasn't that he was confused by everything that was happening around him. What was so puzzling to Tommy was that even though it was the students who were cowering, it seemed the teachers were yelling at the other teachers and not at the students so much. That is, it seemed that way until he got to the boardrooms. When Tommy arrived at the boardroom area, most of the boardrooms were closed, although there was one teacher and one student in each one of them. One was open with a class of students inside sitting around the table and a line of teachers awaiting their turn in a single file line leading out from its doorway. The teacher at the front of the line was speaking calmly to the students and answering questions like in a routine classroom setting, but next door on either side, each teacher frustratingly hollered at their respective students. It no longer seemed that the teachers were yelling at one another. Tommy started to one of the teachers in line. "Is this warranted?" It was all he could think to say. "Jump into one of these empty boardrooms and close the door," the teacher at the back of the line told him. "This one is for future teachers and is in class right now." Tommy jumped into what he thought had been an empty boardroom and opened the door to enter, but when he did, he caught the tail end of a teacher's rant at the student inside the horror of it all. "In my day," the teacher was yelling, "there weren't any computers, and we actually saw who was speaking. You got yourself surrounded in books here, and your head's in a computer every time. Don't you know that you're driving yourself insane that way?" "Sorry," Tommy said softly as the teacher reared. "I don't know what exactly this all is, but studying is studying, man, whether you assign your way or not." "Can you mark your place on the computer with matches?" the teacher yelled at him. "Do your lover's oils soak into the pages of the internet? Does it look different under candlelight? How's your sleeping? How's your eyesight?" This scared Tommy as he realized he hadn't had much of a life away from his computer since 2 days prior, and he had been awake for as long as those 2 days. The teacher was right about these things. He rubbed his eyes. The teacher was even right about his eyesight. All in all, any challenge to his senses would have scared him a little in his dreamlike state, but the yelling obviously wasn't especially jarring. "You stare enough at the screen," the teacher continued, "and you lose your senses. You won't even know." Tommy had to admit that there wasn't any rational explanation to meeting with teachers during a power outage in the middle of the night. Either this was a dream or this was the phenomenon. He had to ask, "Oh, what the hell is going on in here?" Tommy finally spoke. "Isn't this supposed to be the library?" "These are the professors and the students," the teacher explained. "The professors and the students of the new world. This is the way it has to be with those who need extra teacher assistance. They request it, but they request it from a computer program, and we teachers come on to campus a few hours early to catch the young minds that are studying the wrong ways. It's been this way for about a year now. Not my idea, but as you can see, I'm one of the ones that are here for it." "It's just a bunch of teachers yelling at students," Tommy hollered at him, even louder still. No, the teacher explained, clasping his hands in the air. "It's not at all yelling all the time. Most of the students understand some of what we're saying once they listen. So you do it after hours when they close the library and let students in so you can yell." Tommy couldn't have measured his fury if he'd been asked to try. This teacher seemed to be the most fearful person in the new that he'd ever witnessed. "Why are you even taking this?" he asked the student, who was looking up from the corner. "We refine study habits," patiently the teacher went on, "and only the computer study habits are the ones that get yelled at. Tonight being especially profound for those lessons, what with the outage, an ample opportunity to get through to quite a lot of computer junkies when the shutdown occurred." "Pray tell," Tommy couldn't help but demand the teacher's demonstration so that he could shut it down. "Only the ones who really understand will listen, and only those who hear will understand when it comes time for them to come to their own grips. If you're only ever ready to learn on your own terms, then you'll hear, but you won't be listening until those terms are gone. And what if then it's too late?" "Too late," Tommy started, quite unsure how to shut that part down yet. "How do you mean too late?" "The noise," the teacher started calmly, "just the noise of the computers rolling over the relay that they're in the on position, merely their static processing, let alone the active processing. They've driven us all blind with their flickers and deaf with their flanges, and numb in other senses the like. You know all this, don't you?" Tommy began, but his pointing finger seemed to leap off his hand, and he finally realized just how tired his eyesight had become. Probably just from being awake for so long, but he realized the reason he'd been, that maybe the flickering and the flanges had kept him awake. In sort of hypnosis, he had been entranced. "The noise," that teacher continued, "can seem minute in nature, but even the most distinct threshold will eventually go away in our perceptions, even in case our senses aren't yet adapted to them." "But you're talking to me right now," Tommy responded, "and I can see you and you can see me, can't you?" "Without that adaptation," the teacher continued, "we're merely stumbling into one another, basing things on faith that we perceive as what the same is to what we've sensed. We do this in order to keep our dignity and that the senses haven't all but been lost in the shuffle. We know that any sudden change of environment can be traumatic and repressive. Don't you know you have to find your way through the dreams that you build for yourself? Tommy was haunted by this. He exited the boardroom and was on his way out the initial doorway from where he'd come into the building in the first place when he glanced to the line of teachers waiting in line for the class of students in the other room. He looked back through the window to the one from which he just exited, and the teacher and student both shrugged their shoulders. Teacher and student both shrugged their shoulders at him bashfully, neither really seeming to know how to feel. Anyway, he turned toward the doorway again, trying not to notice the few students on computers nodding off in partial slumber as they clicked the mouses. He then exited out from where he'd come in and took to the south end of the building once he was outside, bothered quite the lot by the sunlight casting with the rise of the morning. The resultant actualization struck him at just how long the bit had been with him inside the building, and even just how short the bit had been that he'd gone even further without sleep. Chapter 6. Tommy took to home, where he cycled through the few paperbacks which lay around. He wasn't much a fan of reading at all anymore, not even internet text. He'd reached another of those certain phases by then of slight know-it-allism that come numerous times throughout the course of one's natural life. It wasn't, however, until he truly began to focus on the words that he realized just what had been going wrong. He'd been identifying too much of his own personality with that which he'd been studying. He'd been codependent with his practicing of applications from each of his own courses, and had lost sight of what he'd really wanted out of the college in the first place. So much that he now didn't even know anymore what he'd started out in college wanting, and so he flipped softly through those few paperbacks which had lingered in his collection over the years, and he read. Chapter 7. He read one of his hard copy books rather slowly for the first couple of chapters before sitting back and absorbing what had actually happened at the library. But had it really? It came straight from this book, and Tommy doubted the professors had taken from this book for their own lessons. The book read about his stumble to the building in great detail, as if it had happened for somebody else. The professor hollering to the children was in the book. It even read some of the riddle spinner into the greeter to the fairy tale. So much had been similar that Tommy had to clutch himself in a few different areas slowly just to be sure he wasn't himself some fictional character. Well, that was that. No more from paperbacks if he couldn't read them without reading his own experience. He went outside to light another cigarette for the night or morning, promising he'd sleep off those concerns and report what had happened in the library to his day personnel in the morning. In the morning. He glanced toward his phone and clicked it on, which read that there was a half hour still before the doors would unlock for official business, so he decided to take a walk around the neighborhood. This walk turned into one long zigzag from street to street, then over and back again in all directions. He hadn't exactly gotten to know his neighborhood completely, but that the streets were generally north-south and east-west made it much easier than it could or should have been for him to understand fully that if he wasn't lost, he was wandering. He thought he had circled back through toward the campus by the time that he had reached the main road, and by then could admit to himself that the whole ordeal within the library had just been some soon-to-be-explained misunderstanding, but was more than out of the ordinary on his thoughts for what had happened with the book. The idea of the two being related, like in the case of some play rehearsal, or incidentally the exact book he would go home to discover, just seemed far too convenient, and he less likely now that he'd cleared his head about what the man had said, thought it likely. Maybe Tommy's own mind was the problem. Maybe he was seeing merely what he wanted to see, and had gone all this time not ever knowing of blindness and deafness until finally listening instead of just hearing. what he wanted. Maybe people had been trying to tell him all along, and he never gave the opportunity, hearing what he wanted and seeing what he wanted literally. And if the teacher was just his sleep-deprived dream, then what was he trying to tell himself anyway at that? Chapter 8. A good hour having passed while he was strolling away from the campus, before Tommy realized he had turned right instead of left at that main road, he became embarrassed. He was so embarrassed at having gotten lost on his own campus that while he was coming back toward the house, he pretended to shield his eyes from the risen sun just to cover his face from the going traffic. The morning air was warm considering how early it was. Teachers, well, the normal ones, would just be waking up to start their days, still at home before coming into work. It seemed like he was walking in this city for the first time since his arrival at his initial student orientation some 3 years before, although he'd been that way plenty in those college years since. Most of the restaurants were out this way, and he took in their smell with glee. He thought over his education and the oncoming senioritis for which he'd been preparing so rigorously these past months, and as strange as it was, he took somewhat into consideration some of what that so-called teacher had told him in the boardroom. He had already become complacent with his studies, even if it was a diligent complacency. Wait, were these thoughts of his making sense? Well, anyway, he thought over how he had become a hermit for the sake of an easy finish doing what he loved, even if what he loved had become studying, and eased his tensions and stress toward the relief he would soon be getting from the library clerk about what had really been going on there overnight. Then the sun was again in his eyes. He decided to take toward home again and sleep off all this consideration before he would deliberate on any further and with any new sort of outlook or confrontation, knowing that the library would still be open when he arose in the early afternoon of this Monday. Then he noticed how close he'd come to kicking her in the shin, and he stumbled to miss falling over the girl reading on the curb in front of the house next door to his. "Whoa there," the young lady said. "Whoa," he announced, half to respond and half just to catch his balance, and he stumbled over her. "Sorry about that." He finally caught his balance, on the other side of her and spun back around to get a good look. "You," the young lady proposed. "You know, you're that boy next door, aren't you?" Tommy was catching his breath. "I'm Janie," the young lady introduced herself. "You live next door to some friends of mine. We met at one of the house parties they had last weekend." "Would this have been a bonfire party?" Tommy asked, bewildered. "Yeah, they said there are lots of bonfires here. That's sort of cool." "Yeah, I'm sort of a hermit though recently," Tommy told her. "You're lucky to have even caught me outside." "Well, it was nice." "Huh," Tommy grunted apologetically. "Everything okay?" "Well, it's just that I've just had a really weird night," Tommy told her while gesturing behind her, "and I'm getting ready for a long nap before it gets weirder, but maybe if you want, you can come back later on and come with me to the library." "You mean the one they're tearing down?" No, the campus library. That's the one they're tearing down. I just came from there, though." "You just came from there, so then you must have seen all the barrels." Janie was a little beguiled. "You know, the caution signs all over, orange tape, that sort of thing." "I don't think they're that far along yet," Tommy told her. "I was inside the place. I walk by there every morning on the way to class, man. It's blocked off, all tore up." "Well, anyway, it was open. The lights were on, and it was open even though it wasn't supposed to be." "You snuck in?" she asked him, now finally excited to hear it from him straight. "Well, yeah," he answered. "I mean, I'll be here. What time?" she demanded. Chapter 9. "What do we do anyway?" Janie asked, "if the doors are open?" They walked the dimly lit parking lot cautiously, Janie giggling to herself, Tommy somber in his approach. You'll be in for a treat, Tommy answered her, and I'll be ready with my own questions this time. You say that the teachers were basically just hollering at the kids? Not all of them. To some of the kids, the teachers were soft-spoken and gentle, although the message was quite clear that the loitering was incidental. They approached the main entrance, and Janie reached with her hand for the handle, but Tommy blocked her, shaking his head no. He pointed around to the sign, which was lit up now with real light fixtures, not just fluorescent ones, and nodded his head once, slowly. What's the matter? Janie asked. Don't you want to go in and see what's up? These weren't the doors that were open, he answered. We really should try around the back if we want to meet the weird custodian. That is, if he's still around. The back entrance it is, Janie said excitedly as they made their way around the building. By the way, who were some of the teachers that were in there anyways? The custodian is the sort you'd probably remember, although he'd rather called himself one of the greeters, Tommy answered her fondly. Had greeters? She was taken quite a bit aback, so much that it slowed her timing toward the doors just long enough to break the slightly large stick of which she was standing atop. What was that noise? Tommy quickly asked, startled just enough by the stick breaking to breathe just heavy enough to worry Janie. Noise? She replied. It sounded like somebody turning the key to one of these locks somewhere. She stepped back from him slowly. I didn't hear anything, and I'm starting to wonder whether I'm in my right mind to come along with you if you're going to say things to try and scare me. She breathed deeply and then let her breath out in one large sigh before apologizing. You might have actually heard something, though, so it was probably just somebody else who's walking, perhaps stepping on to some of the campus roughage. She spoke so deliberately in order to sink into Tommy's mind what exactly the sound he thought was worrisome probably was. As she held up the stick, she knew she'd broken. This is what it was to live within a construct of reality-based senses of logic, but Tommy wouldn't be diverged by any of that. How long have you lived here anyways, Janie? He asked personally. I've seen you about a dozen times by now, but you only come out like never, so kind of a while. Really? He said, finally diverged, stopping his racing mind from its current thoughts. A dozen times, you say? Yeah, the times you're even in sight are when you leave with books and come back with other books. She described a tendency of his with some cheer and the most elegant of humor. What, are you just that obsessed with the library? The books are from the bookstore, actually, he told her, squelching the humor with all seriousness. They're only ever on me when I'm taking them home to copy the serial number, and then again when returning them for refunds. How, she began, you're quite the pirate there then, huh? Preferring to be deemed resourceful, he explained, we pirates of today's age only want the deserved methods for their deserved costs. The deserved costs being nothing? She asked. Hey, there's the initiative of finding them, isn't there? I'm even waving to you some of the time, she said after pausing for quite a long while. But have you gotten somewhat used to you never noticing? I have. They reached the other end of the library and turned the corner toward the maintenance entrance, Tommy gazing toward it with hopeful eyes and Janie rolling hers. He took hold of the door's handle and gave it one big tug, but it didn't budge. Hey, he muttered. Chapter 10. Janie had decided to go home for the night instead of risking it any further with Tommy, who then decided he better get to the bottom of this whole mess from home where he wouldn't get into any trouble wandering the lots by himself. He tried his best to sleep, but he couldn't once he realized that some of what he was trying to gather information on might be, well, not in an e-book, on the actual internet, so he searched for it. There weren't any journals in coordination with the school, but when Tommy searched the teacher's name, the teacher with whom he'd been speaking, into some of the search engines, he discovered an article that struck him very curiously. The article described the very essence of sight and other senses to begin with, but with the main idea the desensitization caused from glaring at a computer screen, listening to the notification blips, and processing only the digital, and so on and so forth. His article described that in the so-called information age we live in, we've lost not only our senses of logic, but the actual physical abilities to sense the world around us. Computer noise of the visual and auditory type have blinded and deafened us all to the world around us. This exact thing the teacher had told him frightened Tommy all over again. Had the door been bolted all the time and Tommy the sucker in his insomnia to make the whole thing up for itself? Was Janie really taken along on the wild goose chase she then called it to be? He cleared his thoughts and shook his head hard for some very long moments before looking back to the screen, but upon gazing back up from his dazed and confused state after doing so, he noticed that the clock on the bottom corner of the screen had turned for 2 hours and some minutes. Backward. He'd fallen asleep nearly 22 hours with his hands on the keyboard. He then dared to look back to the screen one more time before completely turning himself off for the night. What he saw scared the pants off him again. Quite. And he lost all the desire in him left for having another late night again. Ever. The screen was not on the search results for some teacher he'd found, but logged on in the word processor, with typed out letters just mashed together and red lines everywhere to some 10 pages. The cursor was flashing at the end. He could not read any of it upon first glance until it began to make sense to him what had happened. He'd been sleeping all along, while typing where he'd been with his note-taking after staying up to finish it. Staying up too late. He trashed it and all the other ebooks he had read, unplugged the computer with an abruptness he never thought he'd desire to do, not even bothering to turn it off first, and lay on his bed to the elegant sounds of silence. With his eyes finally losing sight of the room around him, he lost track of when they finally closed and woke up late that night. Chapter 11. What do you make of this whole information technology age we're living in? Tommy asked his professor after his philosophy course. He had returned to school, reinvigorated, and without any help from the computer. You'll have to be more specific, his teacher responded to him. How is this on topic with the shared sense of reality? Or sense of shared reality? Well, Tommy began, if the reality that we all must share is skewed by our threshold of noise avoidance, then would we maybe share reality collectively in one main mode and median from each of our expectations as individuals? You mean to say that because we so habitually tune out noises to our senses, we may get to a point where we lose track of the real things out there to sense? My question assumes that, but the question itself is this, Tommy described. If we get to that point where we lose our ability to sense, then would our expectations of what's to be sensed take over and make us think we're still sensing? Tommy, his philosophy teacher began. Or would we know we've lost our sights and hearings and touches and smells and tastes? We were actually going to discuss that very point, Tommy. That because the senses are only spotted in our logic perception, we often remember our full senses with different details from one person's memory to another's, only if independent from one another, and that even the strongest groupthink of our world itself, very simply put, may have been merely imagined by the person with the strongest perseverance in order to fill in those gaps. And if we see with gaps, Tommy stirred, whether we've reached our certain threshold of seeing what's real despite those gaps, then would trying to view beyond our thresholds help that sense or toll on it to make it worse? Tommy, the teacher said, slightly sighing and slightly chuckling. It seemed to me that somebody would know rather quickly just how much of their imagination is being worked if it were being worked overboard. But, Tommy said quickly, with pointing his finger into the air, if imagination were being overworked, then how would one know what type of thought was really being overworked at all? I mean, perhaps I'm trying to ask whether there's such threshold of reality for basing our logic. Perhaps there really is that threshold governed by some all-natural perseverance of mean, mode, median, like you said then, said the professor. So what if anybody came along to manipulate our very expectations of reality? Tommy finally dared to ask. That would be called, his teacher answered him, political sanction, and our democracy was put into place to avoid it. The two continued to discuss reality logic in relation to shared hypnosis and perception and to all-out shared psychosis and hallucinations. If the entire world had gone blind from overworking the sight, reading computer texts, and in turn overworked their imagination and lost all sense of logic, then the stretch of common perception threshold would slide up the scale into wider scopes of the dimension in which we are set, in order to acquire the skill sets needed in sensory perception to do so. In short, we would adapt. With this understanding, the two finally agreed that details would be skewed, but big picture realities, as they're called, would be more swiftly understood. And even though the threshold of knowing these things rather pleased Tommy, he finally came to understand something. He came to understand that blaming computers was simply his way of not having understood the point that he was trying to make to himself all along, the point that he simply needed sleep, real sleep. Chapter 12. Tommy felt he was very right just to be afraid of the idea that there were people out whom were shaking other people's realities, even if his own witness to such events was just his own nightmare. If in the real world somebody could shake someone else's reality, then that someone could just as easily shake others' opinions while they were stuck up in that vulnerable state. Whether political opinions were actually being shaken or not mattered little, simply considering that they could be, and Tommy spent a long while criticizing public service offices which sanctioned such events, supervised by the very people putting them on. In this country, those offices included his churches, which made him very curious over whether he was in the right to criticize. Those offices also included his country's very jury system and organized charities, just to name a couple, and even the brave military protecting his right to criticize those offices. These things made him feel even more curious. Whatever his nightmare had really, truly been coming from, it had changed him into a revolutionist. Perhaps that's to say it worked, and perhaps that's to say it didn't. He didn't know, and so he put the fear out of his mind and thought out what he'd started of his own accord on the computer. He knew that only in knowing himself the better could he understand the morals that had gotten to him from before it, only this time it was with pen and paper. Was he starting his own regime with likeness? Maybe, but writing it out would let him know just what had changed in him, and what he was okay with having had changed in him. Over the next year, and even the handful after graduation, he discovered that whether his world was experienced through reality of senses or through imaginative creations for his own, it was only in the foresight of expectations that he would coincide with any innovations, and only in his hindsight of expectations that being told by others would govern his life indefinitely. Through the realities of the senses to a greater depth than he could understand, what he put into the world would be what the world would give back to him, just as the idea that if he only ever took, then he'd never have any original contributions to make for his future. He certainly wanted to put his very best foot forward, even if not ready to persevere, so to continue his traditional grief that if you can't win with them, you might as well join them. He may have no choice but to build on what's been laid already out for him, but he made his decision through those courses to make his eventual living with Foresight. The end. Foresight. Set in the near-distant future, Foresight is the story of the pitfalls and tolls and taking life lessons for granted and selling them short, learning that to be even more costly than the growing of any future by means of our assumptions.